We're now going to take a look at some lighting and rendering techniques. Um, there are a lot of different ways you can separate the lighting between the instances and the rest of the scene, and also set up different compositing tags for more advanced render options. Because native objects, when using the native objects in the populations, they can be basically controlled directly with compositing tags and the include exclude for lights as they normally would be within a scene. We're mostly going to take a look at the effect on the semaphore or on the carbon scatter plants because there's really not a whole lot of ways to modify some of the different settings for them. So we're going to take a look at some different options to light and also change color of different instances. Some settings are going to be compatible with network rendering, and there are some settings that are not going to be compatible or will technically won't even save with the scene, but as long as you render on the same system, they will work. So it does work for matte painting and things like that. There are some important features and multipass options that you can get to work. Unfortunately, most of those options aren't saved. We'll get to that. So let's start by adding in an ecosystem to this landscape object. And I'm going to use the cherry tree and add in the alder late spring. And if we take a look at our document mode, I'm using 1 meter, so therefore, in order to get accurate scale, it should be set to 0.1. Just for the sake of render speed and really kind of being able to show this stuff a little better, I'm going to increase the scale a little bit, and then I'm going to change my slope range. And that way we can also see more of the object. If we take a look at the options, I've got 10,000 max showing, and I'm only using one variation right now per plant species. We can increase the objects generated and the materials generated by changing this amount, but I'm just going to go ahead and stick with 1 just to speed things up. Okay, so the current lighting setup is a distant or an infinite light with ray trace shadows set to hard. I have an ambient light. I'm just using a point light, and then I can adjust the ambient lighting. Now this is set up to affect everything. So right now it's going to affect the instances and the landscape. Now before I do any renders or anything, let's take a look at the actual object container. If we go to Layer Browser, once we created a carbon scatter ecosystem, a carbon scatter layer was created. And by default, it is hidden from the manager, and it's locked. So you need to select under the M and under the L to unlock it and show it in the manager. What we're going to see it as an environment object with a proxy texture on it, which is the carbon scatter volume. Within that, we have 2 objects, or 3 actually, one containing 2. The ecosystem generator, and now this icon that you're seeing, the little carbon scatter logo, that I did. It doesn't actually come with a little logo, it'll just be a gray box, but you can replace that within the res folder of the plugin. If we take a look, here's the res folder, and I just replaced the carbon scatter TIFF file with this carbon scatter TIFF file in order to show the icon on the generator. What we're going to see is, in this case, we have two materials. Now the materials will range depending on the previewing mode. If you're showing the geometry quality, what's going to happen is it's going to generate extra material maps just for displaying the geometry. If we take a look at the materials, we have the carbon scatter layer and one material for each object, and it combines the trunk and the leaves in one material. Now there's one exception. The version I'm using right now uses transparency instead of the alpha. This is a big issue. I'm working with Eon right now to get this corrected. Hopefully, this might not even be an issue for you. Get it fixed soon enough. Transparency channel is basically incompatible with Z-depth, motion passes. It causes bad calculations of GI, and it takes a lot longer to render. So what I'm going to do, and keep in mind this will not save with the scene. Every time you reload the scene, it will regenerate these objects and these material maps and reassign them back to the default state. But this will work while the scene is still open, and it will also allow you to render animations and stills with these settings. Also, the object buffers are incompatible with the transparency. If you get it to work or set it on the alpha, then it will work. So let's take a look at what it looks like without this change, just in case this hasn't been fixed yet or modified. What I'm going to do is set up a multipass. I'm going to add in object buffer of 1, and I'm going to set my tag in a minute. And then I'm going to add the depth channel. And we'll do the RGBA image, and that should be just fine. We're going to go to the camera, and the camera settings, what I'm going to change, or set up, is under the camera we set our depth, target distance to 0, and then set the rear blur. And this is just going to give us a full depth. This is a great modifier for Z-depth, and I'm just going to extend it to the range of the scene, just a little bit beyond. Typically you just set this to as far as what you can see within the scene. So now if I just render this out, and I'm going to do very low anti-aliasing just to get this to render out quickly, and I'm going to also decrease my scale, and I'll just render that out. We'll take a look at these options. And I'm going to cancel the render because I did forget to set up the compositing tag. What we're going to do is on the carbon scatter scene, we're going to right click, Cinema 4D, add a compositing tag, and under the object buffers we're going to add object buffer 1. And check that on. Okay, so here's our render. Just pretty low res. 800 by 600. If we take a look, it does look like the object buffer is working pretty well, although there are some artifacts showing. But if you take a look at the depth, what we're going to see is the polygons and not the cutout leaves. That's the biggest problem with the transparency. That the multipass buffers don't work. It does look like the object buffer's working alright. I think I will go ahead and increase scale so we can take a look a little bit closer. There's also issues with flickering when it comes to transparency, and there's actually a lot of reasons why the alpha channel is important. We'll take a look just a sec how to switch it over. Another thing, this is going to be important no matter what, whether or not this issue gets fixed or not, or really changed over. It does work alright with transparency, but alpha is a lot better in many, many ways. Okay, so if we take a look in the render settings and go to options, for scenes with vegetation, the default values are not good enough. They're not high enough. The ray depth is set to 15. The shadow depth is set to 15. What the ray depth is how many objects we can see through a transparent object. So if we were looking through one of these transparency or alpha maps to see trees behind it, we would see 15 more objects before it stops rendering. Now that's a problem with a lot of the view plants because they have a lot of leaf polygons, and definitely more than 15 stacked on top of each other, which can cause weird rendering, and especially with animation, as you're moving over the trees, you're going to see stuff disappearing. It's not going to look right. What I like to do is set my ray depth to 100, my shadow depth to between 25 and 50, and right now there's no reflections, but your reflections will also need to be somewhat compensated for that, to make sure that if you have still water or something like that, or glass, that objects aren't disappearing in that as well. This number needs to go higher with animation. Animated instances, obviously the carbon scatter plants are not animated, so not as big of an issue. We could even bump down the ray depth to 50 because of that. 50 should be good enough for most scenes. Like I said, I like 100 and then 25 for the shadow depth, and that's how many shadows everything's going to cast. That typically doesn't show up as poorly as the ray depth would if it's set too low. So let's take a look at a render with these new settings. Okay, so here's the new render. As you can see, for the most part, the object buffer actually works pretty well. I have noticed on some plants, and at least the ones I was testing before, the object buffer was only showing the polygons. I do know that if you use this as a matte object within the compositing tag, it will only show polygons because it's part of the object. Now if we move to the depth channel, we can see much clearer just that we only have the polygons showing. So we don't have any cutouts, and it's going to make it really difficult to do any sort of compositing with this. So the way we can change this is we do have the ability to modify the materials. So we're going to go back to our CS object materials, and the ones that are going to be rendering are the ones that have both the leaves and the bark in the same image. The preview proxy materials are going to be just leaves or just the bark. So what we can do is take our transparency, copy it, paste it onto the alpha channel, turn on pre-multiplied, and turn off soft mode. And then we can go over to the next and copy the transparency map, go to the alpha, paste it, turn on pre-multiplied, turn off soft, and then we also want to turn off the transparency on each channel. So now we're running it through an alpha. I'm going to go to the anti-aliasing and just bring it up to 1 by 1, 2 by 2. And let's take a look at that now. Okay, so the first thing I want to note is that the last render took 2 minutes and 15 seconds at an anti-aliasing of 1 by 1 by 1 by 1. With the alpha mode, the render took 1 minute and 40 seconds with the anti-aliasing at 1 by 1 by 2 by 2. So, increase the anti-aliasing and was able to decrease the length and the render time. So there's a huge difference between render times, but also let's take a look at some of the other impacts. So if we go over to the layer and take a look at the depth, now we can see through all of the leaves and the objects, and we have a depth channel that is useful. So even the object buffer will look a lot better because of the way it cuts out leaves around the edges. You'll be able to pick out a lot more detail. So a big difference. hopefully this is something that gets fixed very quickly. I would very much like to see this as something we could render over networks. Right now, like I said, if I save the scene with these changes made to the materials, load it back in, what's going to happen is they're going to be rewritten, and it's going to go back to the default of the transparency channel. So working on getting that fixed at the moment. Hopefully Eon will take care of that and listen to me. Another thing is, I mean, you can, at this point, basically change the material to anything you want. You can switch out the textures and use your own textures, modify the colors. We could go into, set this up as a layer, modify the color, contrast. The only thing is, like I said, the biggest problem is not going to save. So I'm mainly working on getting the alphas fixed because that's the most important, I think, because there are other things we can do to modify the materials. So let's take a look at individual lighting setups. And what we can do is right now I have basically that ambient light that is controlling everything. And the reason I'm using an ambient light rather than using the environment object, and even the carbon scatter scene is within an environment object, and we can use that. You'll notice in other parts of the training where the environment object sometimes, if you have other ones in the scene and you populate with carbon scatter, it adds the new environment object, which overwrites the other one, which is why it basically requires you to delete and add a new environment object. And that's just because the carbon scatter scene itself is in an environment object. Because of some of those issues, I just prefer to use the lights. It'll end up working better. So what we can do, if we want to set up, in this case we'll set up individual ambient light for the terrain and anything in the scene that isn't a carbon scatter instance. So what we want to do is copy the light, paste it. So now we've got two that are identical at the moment, and I'll just rename one of these CS. Or just put a CS at the end for carbon scatter. What we're going to set up for this is exclude for the original ambient light, and we're going to exclude the carbon scatter scene. So now, if we go ahead and turn off the other ambient light, and I'll just render a region, we'll see ambient light only showing on the terrain, and there will be no ambient lighting on the instances. And that is fairly dark because I'm a lot in shadow at the moment. And I did have a filter set up before, so what I'm going to do is go to the picture viewer and go to the filter and select create post effect. I'm just going to add color correction. You can also turn off the multipass for now. And I'm going to turn off the enable filter so that way it won't double up on the filter. So you could see before, and I'll just, now with the new settings, render a small region. Okay, so clearly no ambient lighting on the leaves. Now rendering ambient occlusion is going to be quite a task. So the key thing to really do is keep the ambient lighting down lower for the plants, and that way we get darker insides. So what we're going to do is take this other light and we're going to change it to include. So it's going to exclude everything in the scene except what we include in the list. And what we're going to include is the carbon scatter scene. So now we can adjust the ambient lighting for just the carbon scatter instances. So let's reduce that down to, say, 26. We can also change our color. Right now I'm using a darker color. Let's go ahead and make this a little more obvious by using lighter colors. and then take a look. Okay, so now I probably have my ambient light up way too high for the landscape. But you can see how we can very easily just kind of change things throughout the scene independently of each other, which is really, really nice. So let's go ahead and bring down that other ambient light. And if we wanted, we could change the ambient light to more of a yellow for the plants. And that looks pretty good. So for just basic lighting, it's a nice technique, and of course we can increase the intensity further. And negative intensities will also be possible, which I'll show in just a sec. Okay, so the higher value, we can see that. I also want to note for animation with the alphas, you can really get away with a value of 1 by 1, or sorry, for alpha leaves 2 by 2 by 4 by 4. This will, when switched to the animation mode, basically remove any sort of flickering or possibility of flickering 2 by 2 by 4 by 4 if you're rendering in HD. The smaller you render, the more chance there is for flickering, because you're taking very, very small elements and reducing them even smaller. I find this is great for a 2K render. So whether widescreen or setting it up square for a matte, I find these settings are great for animation. 2 by 2, 4 by 4. In geometry, you can do 1 by 1 by 4 by 4 if you've got the tags set up for it, but that won't work for the view objects. Or sorry, the carbon scatter objects. So if we go back to the original ambient light and go over to the scene and remove the exclusion so it does affect everything, and now go into the light that's just going to affect the carbon scatter instances. What I'm going to do is change this to like around a blue color and set the intensity to -30. So now we're going to subtract ambient light. It's also a good idea actually to just turn off the specular. And we can do that for both. It shouldn't really have too much of an impact, but just in case, it's a good idea not to have the ambient affecting the specular. And I am rendering in the animation mode now, which is why it's a lot smoother. I also want to note I do typically set my MIP scale to 60 for animation of environments. What I'm going to do is go back to that ambient light, because that wasn't quite enough. Let's go ahead and bring it down to -70. So you can see that gives a really cool looking color change. A way to basically set up an overall ambient first and then just subtract specific colors. In this case, since we're going negative, we're going to see the opposite end of the spectrum as we subtract. There are some more permanent settings we can make, modify materials that will save with the scene and will render with the network. And that involves basically using light gels. So what I'm going to do is set up, and we'll set up a spotlight. And I'm going to go ahead and adjust my instance display just for the moment. And what we're going to do with this is create a light gel. So we need to create a material. We'll just call it gel. And this needs to be run on the transparency channel to work. So go to transparency, and I'm going to use the colorizer. So go to texture, colorizer, and then within the colorizer we can set a texture of noise. So a noise that's going to run the color variation. And we can add a few different colors in here. And I'm going to switch this over to the world scale. And just the brightness and contrast a little bit. I'm going to go to the brightness, the overall brightness, and set that to 0. And now what we can do is drag the gel onto the light. Now if we only want this light to affect the carbon scatter instances, we can do what we did before for the ambient light and go to scene, set it to include, and then the carbon scatter scene. Okay. So the independent ambience is gone now, so obviously everything is very lightly colored. I'm going to go back to the independent mode, exclude the carbon scatter scene from the main ambient, and then include it in this other one. And we're just going to use a regular intensity and not a negative intensity. So it's a pretty interesting look to it. Typically a darker color is going to work a little bit better in some cases, and really more saturation. You can see some things are kind of washed out. Of course, I didn't really go in and modify things too much. We can also adjust the intensity so it isn't so intense. These also work with negative settings. And I'm going to turn off the specular, and we can also take a look and turn on the ambient illumination. So now we can affect, and I'm going to turn off the CS ambient light, and now control the ambient light with the gel. So a fairly interesting effect. We can also, like I was saying before, use this as a negative. And we could set up an overall color to affect these objects that will mix along with the light gel. Now you can see everything's getting very dark in some areas. So it's something you can really play around with and modify the instances with. And this is something that, of course, will save with the scene and will work over the network, so you can make modifications this way. In that case, the settings were a little too high, too far negative, but a lot of flexibility with it this way. To be able to really add color to different areas and get some pretty neat looking instances out of it. I also want to note that if you want to render ambient occlusion or GI using the compositing tag on the carbon scatter environment object, you can enable specific GI parameters. You can also choose to turn off the scene by ambient occlusion, which will help things render a lot faster if you want to render ambient occlusion on the rest of the scene but not on the plants. So another thing you could do is force the anti-aliasing of the plants to be that 2x2 by 4x4. And in this case, what you would do is if you wanted the geometry and the rest of the geometry in the scene to render at 1x1 by 2x2, you would leave that at the lowest setting. Tags do overwrite but whatever is set up within the render settings needs to be the minimum amount. So if this is set to 2 by 2 by 4 by 4, it will overwrite these settings. But if this is set to 8 by 8, it will overwrite this tag, and this tag will not render at 2 by 2 by 4 by 4. It'll render by 8 by 8. So this is typically your minimum. So what I'll do for geometry-based plants or Cinnamon 4D geometry is render those at 1 by 1 and max level 4 by 4, and then anything with an alpha, leaf alphas, I'll render at 2 by 2 by 4 by 4. And that works pretty well for animation. Gives a very quick render if you're using alpha maps. And one last thing I want to show, which is something that once again is not something that can be saved. It's really going to have to be rendered at that time, which is why it's good for making matte paintings and renders for the multipass, or rendering an animation that can be rendered on a single system with the scene still open. It's a pretty cool technique. What we can do is create a new material, and we're going to run the color. We'll set up a noise, and we'll do something kind of obvious in order to really show it. And I'll set this to a world scale. Let's use a different noise. Okay, I'm going to turn off the specular value, turn off the brightness, and have the mix strength at 100% still. Then what I'm going to do, I'm going to rename it mix, and I'm going to add this. If we expand the carbon scatter environment object, we're going to be placing this on the ecosystem generator. Now, the reason this won't save is because any materials on or assigned to the ecosystem generator are removed every time the scene is reloaded as the new materials are created. What we're going to do is set this to mix textures. So for the tag for that texture, we're going to mix textures. So what that's going to do is mix the color from this material onto the color of the ecosystem. So now we can see that overlay, and we can adjust the blending amount by modifying the percentage within the color, and also the mixing mode for that. It is unfortunate this won't save with it, and it won't work if it's on a different object because of the way the selection tags are set up, and already having assignments for the other objects. So if I drag it up onto the carbon scatter environment object, it won't pass through. It just won't affect the objects inside. So if you can find a way to add this sort of material to the carbon scatter environment object and have it have Cinema think that it's on the object below it. I admit my espresso skills and coffee programming skills are not very good, so I have not yet figured that one out. At least not with it having it stay on the environment object. Normally what I've found how to do, we'll just bump it down, and then it ends up getting deleted. So if we go to that mix, we can also change how we want to mix these. We can multiply, we can add this color to it. If we just set it to normal, we can reduce the mixing strength. And I'm just going to change my anti-aliasing settings for now, just to make it render a little quicker. You can see that change. So even though that looks kind of terrible, it gives you a good idea how you can make the modifications. The lighting in this scene right now is a little off. Ambient lighting isn't set properly for the landscape, and then I've got that filter running over it, which was working well before but doesn't work well for this setup. It gives you a good idea how you can really get down into the objects themselves and make custom modifications to the carbon scatter plans.